Hey, welcome to another episode of the TestGuild Automation Podcast. This week, in honor of SeleniumConf happening in Valencia, Spain, I'm taking things way back to 2017. I'm re-releasing an interview I did with the creator of Selenium himself, Jason Huggins, recorded live at SeleniumConf that year. Now, full transparency, this was actually the very first in-person interview I ever recorded. And for reasons that now seem ridiculous, I picked one of the noisiest spots at the venue to do it. I even got comments like, why would you interview him there? Fair question. But thanks to the magic of AI, I've cleaned it all up using an audio enhancer tool that stripped out most of the background noise. So now you can finally hear Jason in all his audiophile glory as he shares the origin story of Selenium and even dives into the early rise of automation and robots. You don't want to miss it? Check it out.
Could you just tell us why you created Selenium? What was your thought? And did you ever think it'd get as big as it actually got?
Right. I mean, so it's how much time do you have? Right. So I have no short stories. So I was the tech lead on this project, and Jim Evans at the SauceCon this week gave a couple of a version of it. It's mostly correct. But what came down to, I was a tech lead on a project. So we had 10 or so people working. We're working on an internal time and expense tool. And the mandate for this was it had to be fast, because if you're a consulting firm, really your only internal system that you care about is the billing system, so you can get paid. And at the time the company I was at, ThoughtWorks, they were expanding globally. It used to be just Chicago, but then they were expanding in England and India and whatever. So all of a sudden the latency that was fine, that local area network in Chicago, all of a sudden was a huge problem when people from London were connecting to the Chicago system. So the current system was super slow. So it had to be fast. That sets the context for details I did later. So this is actually 2003, 2004, still actually kind of in the .com nuclear winter.
Right. Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot of budget to do really anything, but we had basically people threatening me in London and India just over latency to Chicago headquarters. So that sets the scene. So hey, it's 2003, 2004. Let's do this web thing, right? It's been around for a while. So the previous app was a Lotus Notes app. We're going to do a web app, right? Very specific thing though, when it gets actually fast forwarding to Selenium, we wanted to in a timesheet or a billing kind of context, we want to have this little web form, and we want to have, if you had more than 10 items in your expense report or whatever, we wanted to add a row. The state of the art in a web app would be to send that whole thing to the server. The server will do all the rendering, adding rows to HTML tables, and send it back. But I knew with a whole couple hundred consultants, that's going to be a high latency. It's not going to be fast.
Right.
So I had this idea, wait a second, actually, if you go into this JavaScript thing, you can modify the web page and you can change the page however you want. And you can avoid the trip to the server. It's awesome. The downside is that at the time, JavaScript was super flaky and inconsistent between all the different browsers.
Right. Yep.
So we had very strong discussions amongst the other engineers where it's you shouldn't use JavaScript. Using JavaScript is a career limiting move. It is a bad idea, and you're a bad person, and you should feel bad for using JavaScript. This is 2003, 2004.
Yep.
That's 2004.
Right.
So we actually, I let them win the argument for a month. We re-architected, so everything went to the server and came back, and then of course it was slow. It's no, screw it. So we put in the code to add, just to dynamically add a row to your expense report. But then, as it proved out to be, we had, I called it the sine wave of quality, where what happened was it would work in an Explorer 1 week, and then someone would change something, and all of a sudden, it would now be working in Firefox. This is actually pre-Firefox 1.0. So this is Firefox 0.9. Mozilla was the browser at the time. So it would be working in Firefox, but they would accidentally break in IE. Of course, they didn't test it in IE because their personal browser was Mozilla or whatever. And so every other week it was working in one of those browsers. So it's that was annoying. That was requirement number one. Okay, I can't get them to test all the browsers all the time every time they touch something. So I want to test in two browsers. It was also annoying that just things were breaking that were working yesterday. So I want something as kind of a regression, kind of a check before they push. I implemented this one rule of there has to be at least one functional test for whatever you do before you put it in production. Anyway, so I wanted to have a test. So, and it was frustrating. And in that context of the state of the art, whether it was open source or commercial tools, because everyone considered JavaScript a horrible, bad idea, the open source tools, you could only ever do like regular expressions on like the HTTP response, like the text mechanized is a very popular tool. And all it did was do assertions on the text response. It didn't assume you'd be doing assertions on the browser, the rendered page. And the commercial tools would, because, Microsoft had like 95% market share. Why would you test any other browser? Like I had other conversations about that. Why would you care about two browsers? That's pointless. It's just a bunch of hippies care about the other stuff. Oh, and that Apple thing? Oh, Apple's dead, right? I mean, again, this is the world.
People don't realize that, but
that's what Outline 4, JavaScript limiting move. Apple, that's cute. But like, we don't do video processing. We don't do, whatever. But we were like a trend-setting consulting company. So everyone had MacBooks and and everyone was using Mozilla, whatever. So I didn't want to create a testing tool. Sorry, again, long story. Sorry.
Oh, it's good.
We sought out other open source tools. The closest was the JS unit, so JavaScript unit. Like it was in a browser kind of rendering stuff, but it was very test focused, not functional test. Like it didn't know how to go from page to page to page, just in one page. Also, there was another one, HTML unit. Was a Java project, and it was like a headless browser. It had a kind of a JavaScript thing, but it wasn't a real browser, so you couldn't tell if that matched a real browser experience, right? So again, like the requirement was two browsers, like one test, drive two browsers, and assuming you're going to be interacting with some kind of JavaScript app and doing assertions like after JavaScript did something interesting. So there was really nothing. So I actually took a break from the project I was leading, kind of to start a side project. We kind of, found a conference room and just like disappeared for a month. It was me and like two other thought workers, Paul Gross and then Tina, she goes by Tina, Wang. There's the three of us working on a month on this first thing. And then we had it and the people came by. I actually thought we were going to be famous for this time and expense app that we were making, as it was super, super cool. That was a whole other story where we like evaluated all the time and expense things that were out there. Of course, like, big surprise for a consulting firm. We did a review of all the packaged apps and we came with the expert decision that we were going to have to write a custom package ourselves. But I really thought that the time and expense thing was going to be interesting. But people came up to me after we got it up and running. We had the IE tests and the Mozilla Firefox tests. It was actually fun to watch, right? Turn on the monitor, see it go. No, like a lot of people, I hadn't like really kind of seen that kind of, it's kind of fun. It's really fun.
It is.
Sometimes when I'm it would be running on the computers in my office and I would forget that it's at the top of the hour. It's kind of like a poor person's CI system where you just like link it to a batch file, schedule it to run at the top of the hour. And sometimes I forget. It's kind of like Big Ben, blasting. All of a sudden I hear this clicking from the computer. The monitor would be off, but IE sends when you click, whatever. Well, too long of a story. But people would come and ask me about our testing tool. I wanted to talk and pivot to time and expense app. Right. That was super, super cool. This is just one part of it. So I think, to answer your other question, I think I realized it was like a thing when I kept on getting more questions about it. I think we're completely unsolicited. I started getting invitations to talk about it at other places, like other consultants at ThoughtWorks were in other people in London and whatever were telling their clients about it.
Oh, cool.
That was actually one of the things that made it easier. It was easier to open source it, to get it to our clients. Some of them had really weird procurement policies. So it was easier just to open source it, to download it, as opposed to negotiate some kind of agreement. So once it was kind of out there, people would start using it and start having questions. And then it just kind of took on a life of its own. Anyway, super long story.
Oh, very cool. No, that's awesome.
But it came from a very technical thing. I didn't want to create a testing tool, but it like fell into it. I didn't know at the time there was a testing industry. There were books. There was like, you could have an entire career in it. It was just like this annoying problem where JavaScript was like bumming me out.
Yeah. So you had a problem, you scratch your own itch, and all of a sudden a lot of people really benefited from it.
Right. Sorry. It's super long.
No, it's cool. So it seems like your vision keeps getting bigger and bigger. So you just started off like testing an app and then creating an app that tests it. And then all of a sudden you get into cloud. Once again, early 2008, I think is really early. Was it 2008 for Sauce Labs?
Yes. Found it. So Selenium was the very first release of Selenium was like first beta or what do you want to call it? First prototype. It's like April 2004. It was actually, I think, formally released as a project in like fall 2004. And we founded Sauce Labs in July of 2008. So And before that, I left ThoughtWorks to go to Google.
Yep.
And so I've been accused of planting the seeds of a problem. And whatever I create, it solves a problem, it creates a problem.
Right.
And so the next problem, now that you can test in every browser, the problem is running a lab of all these browsers. Like, so if you have 100 machines, half of them are arbitrarily different. Half of them are IE, half of them are Firefox. What if, then Safari comes out or Chrome comes out? Like, do you buy more machines or do you split your lab? Like, that's the job, right? There were precursors to that. I think I noticed, so it was project when I was still at ThoughtWorks. It was, the developers were threatening mutiny because the build was taking 20 minutes. I mean, it's a pretty simple, like, leap of like, okay, these guys are like about to like not care about testing at all. But it comes down to like, it's 20 minutes. Like, well, how many tests do we have? Like, it's running on one machine. Like, what if we got 4 machines? What would happen, right? So what do you know? Magically, the build took 5 minutes and it was like high fives all around. And they're like, this is awesome. Like, wow, that's weird. I wonder if that is unique to just this group of people. It probably isn't, right? So I think right around that time, a lot of people were realizing like, oh yeah, having lots of Selenium tests. If you run 100 sequentially on one machine, kind of bums you out.
Right.
So a lot of people were dabbling with like kind of making a grid. But before the word cloud was a thing, there's various conferences, but one of them was KitCon is the name of the conference. So Continuous Integration and Testing Conference. The first one was in Chicago. And it was, I think, like 2006. And people, like, footnote to history, people don't remember this, but Sun was arguably the first cloud computing company. No one remembers this, but they had this thing, they called it grid computing. And you could rent their machines or whatever, in the network, whatever. They didn't call it cloud, but for like $1 a minute. But the thing was, when I was like looking like, oh man, how do I just get like quick disposable access to a bunch of machines in like 2006 or 2005? Yep. So I remember at that KitCon conference, like, I think this like grid computing thing, I think it's totally a thing. I think it's a little too expensive. Like the $1 a minute thing is way too weird. And you have to like wrap it up in a batch file and then email it to them or FTP. It was clunky. And then like a year later, EC2 comes out, Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud, and it's 10 cents a minute instead of $1. And then all of a sudden for me, it was the same idea. It was like, oh, way better pricing. And then you get full like shell access to the thing. So that's even better. But at that time, I was at Google. They had the same problem. The Rightly team had an hour-long build, and they're running it in 2 browsers. And someone at Google had also really an idea, like, hey, what if we distribute the machines? So it's one of those things that, like, so true about all inventions. They're almost always invented simultaneously on 2 different corners of the planet. Yep. And it just comes down to a race to whoever can kind of get it done and out the door and tell more people the fastest. But I ended up at Google. And then worked on the Selenium farm. This became this, and it started with the Rightly team, which is like now Google Doc. It became this virtuous cycle where the more people internally at Google heard about this, wow, they went from an hour-long builds to a couple of minutes. The more teams wanted to be part of Selenium farm, which means then we had more budget to add more machines. So it became this huge thing where we kept on adding machines and adding more clients. So that was at Google. But the problem is like, well, who besides Google could just have thousands of machines or whatever, except for Amazon's EC2 and skipping ahead. Met my co-founder at Sauce through a mutual acquaintance, invited him over to the Googleplex, figured, I didn't know him, but mutual acquaintance said we should totally be here. And it's like, okay, fine, I'll show him the rocket ship, show him the ball pit, like whatever, it'll be really fun. He was wanted to be, second time entrepreneur, knew he wanted to do something, but didn't know what the idea was. I was like this techie, but I wanted to do a startup, but I didn't know how to do business. Right. So I wanted to be like a co-pilot to somebody's pilot. And when I told him about like what I'm doing at Google, but it's an extension of my open source work, so it's not like some super secret, like Moon-based project or something like that. It's like a hybrid open Googly thing, but you could do it on the outside because of Amazon. And so the big question in their conversation was like, are there companies besides Google that needs something like that? It reminds me of this old quote, and I forgot who said it, but like it's like the 50s or 60s, like the worldwide market for computers at 5. At the time, that wasn't wrong. It was like the Department of Defense, Harvard, and it was only 5 entities needed. So the big question when we founded it was, are there only Google, Amazon, Microsoft, eBay, Yahoo? I think GAME was the acronym there. Right. I think occasionally various acronyms get swapped in and out. Or sometimes we called it like, the Selenium, Google's infrastructure for the rest of us, right? Yeah. And so we found out, obviously, all these years later that like now, yes, there are more than 5 companies that use Selenium testing. But it came from that once you solve the testing problem in one browser, all of a sudden you have a bigger problem. How do you maintain all these machines?
So you started Sauce Labs, that grew. And then once again, it seemed like you're expanding your vision again, where you moved to robotics. So that's where Tapster Robotics came in, I guess. What made you get into robotics?
So I've always been into it. as a kid. I had this robotic arm, and also my observation about like robotics and like pop culture. It always seems like every 10 years, like there's like this robot hype wave.
Right.
We're in one now.
Yep.
Even though I was pretty young at the time, but in the mid 80s, there was also like this panic over robotics.
Right.
At the time, Japanese manufacturers were coming in, and that was when the robots were taking over car factories. But it spilled over into pop culture. So you had like Short Circuit, the movie, R2-D2.
Yep.
It was just like robots were everywhere,
Right.
which means they were also in all the toy stores. I even had a little robotic arm from Radio Shack. It was my favorite. Besides Lego, that was my favorite toy. But it's been like this philosophical thing of like, it's just been sitting there. It's just a toy. It does nothing. I always wanted to do something real and practical, whatever.
Right.
Oddly, I know I'm going to annoy a lot of people who might hear this, but like the Selenium thing, the sauce thing, that was like the career that I wasn't supposed to have. Like I wanted to just like make things. So along the way, like things like Maker Bear came along, various different kind of open source hardware kind of projects. I was like, oh man, like I want to be over there.
Right.
I don't know how. It's like not exactly midlife crisis, but kind of like, like I'm doing the way I described the cloud is like I'm flipping, electrons and hard drives in a data center that I don't even know where it is.
Right.
It feels very ephemeral and hard to describe to relatives at Thanksgiving dinner, things like that. But like you see a robot on a desk, it's tangible. It might not know what it does or why, but like they can say clearly it exists and it's good. So I thought my interest in robotics and testing were completely divergent paths and just nothing but getting wider and wider, farther apart of my dreams. So like the longer I go in software, the more I'm not building up experience in robotics. I made this as part of like a little art project. I made this little linear actuator is the fancy phrase for it. But it's just goes, forward and back.
Okay. Yep.
I finally made a little prototype for it. Sometimes you can, for various robotic arms, you can use that as an actuator. Well, when I held it upside down, I kind of realized, it's actually kind of like a little button flicker. It's like, oh, that's interesting. And so I had this thought of like, I wonder if I could kind of move it, if I could add another more like, again, bubblegum and duct tape kind of thing and have it flick buttons on a phone. At the time on the career software side, it's like 2000, if the iPhone came out 2007, Android, I think the first release was like maybe 2008, even though they're both working on it at the same time. The big question is how mobile is different than web testing. Yep. Like, how are we going to do it? Right. And so it's kind of like a professional question of like, how are we going to do mobile testing? And it didn't seem like it was really, the answer, but I thought it'd be kind of funny. Like, well, I wonder if part of it is like robots or something, right? Anyway, just as a separate thing, just for the robots, I thought like, well, I wonder if I could make a button clicker. So this was the summer of 2011, I think. Angry Birds was super popular. It seems so long ago now, right? So like, okay, that's my design goal. I'm going to make a little button clicker thing, play Angry Birds and whatever. I put that together. I thought it was going to be an art project, just kind of get like the robot-y part of me. Like I wanted to like it's kind of like a hobby. I was getting frustrated that I wasn't doing anything with it. So I was going to just start making stuff. I got a membership, Tech Shop San Francisco. Even though I live in Chicago, I was here so much that I got a Tech Shop membership here. And so when at every available moment, I would go and hang out in laser cutters and make stuff. But I made this thing. What happened was I showed it off at this conference and people came up to me and they skipped the whole Angry Birds video game playing part of it. And something weird happened. They were like, hey, I work in like the secret robot lab at company XYZ and we use robots to click buttons all day long. I'm like, oh, really? I didn't know that. And they're like, hey, we should totally talk. Like, oh, okay. So I started making kits and kind of selling them, but like almost at cost. Yep. The first orders, it was odd because I would have to wait 3 weeks until the next time I came to San Francisco to get to Tech Shop, or the laser cutter to make more parts. But I started having really weird conversations with lots of companies that we all know, but they all have secret robot labs. Big difference between the hardware world and the software world is that like they're very secret, keyword secret. Yep. So that was 5 years ago. It was kind of a hobby for a while. And then I got a large order for these robots from a very large car company and at that point, it was like, whoa, this isn't a hobby anymore. Like they're taking it seriously. I should take it seriously. So that a couple months later, I formally incorporated Taps for Robotics. If nothing else, I was just imagining this doomsday scenario where, they're like, something bad happens. And then they're like, well, how'd you guys test it? Like, oh yeah, we did everything, including that, like, talk to that guy, right? That's it. Yeah. We used the robots, it's his fault, right? So I definitely wanted to have a company to make sure that like I'm protected. Yep. And anyway, so it's been kind of on this journey since then.
So it's a use case for the robotics that you have. I mean, yeah, I know it's a lot of it's secretive, but start off driving a mobile app using Angry Birds. I mean, there are a lot of user cases that.
So when I first did it, I felt like I had a hunch, and I had these conversations, but it's like, okay, is there a real thing here? I've learned that there's now actually a bunch of verticals. There's obviously device manufacturers. So all the usual suspects for like, whatever device is, in your pocket, or sitting on your desk, the people who make those things have the secret robot lab. The other one is all the car companies. So if everything, thanks to Tesla, but everything is becoming a touchscreen. Right. It's kind of like the touchscreenification of the world. Everything that were like physical dials are all now touchscreens. And then that means all the companies that were otherwise making mechanical switches are now having to become software companies, or have to hire companies that are now software companies as opposed to making a mechanical switch. So a lot of companies in a lot of different industries are freaking out because they're deficient on software development, including testing practices and all this stuff like that. So anyway, so device manufacturers with the touchscreen, basically, car companies. And then also there really is something to this whole IoT thing. Like for a while, it's been kind of this buzzword. So what the particular use case in this is, like, you've got an iPhone and you got some kind of Bluetooth device. And then the scenario is like, what happens when, and they do something together, and it's really important, right? The iPhone connects, it's your toaster, it's your refrigerator, it's parks your car, whatever. And there's scenarios like, what if the Bluetooth disconnects, or what if Wi-Fi disconnects or something, or what if a phone call comes in and interrupts something that was really important, like a streaming video or something like that. And so sometimes you actually have to hit buttons on the phone. Sometimes you have to hit physical buttons on the device. But either way, it's a very real world scenario.
Right.
Kind of like mapping it to kind of like the cloud. It's like, you could run that in the cloud if you had an entire warehouse, almost like a Noah's Ark kind of a thing, where you had a bunch of one device of everything and one of every, like, Bluetooth light bulb in a car. It gets kind of ridiculous. So there's this thing where when you have devices talking to other devices, and there's no real like jump to a network, that scenario, sometimes the only way to really test is like to literally kick the thing. Yeah. Also, there's some scenarios where it was like a real world test. Like, they had one scenario where they had the requirement that they couldn't modify the phone in any way. It had to be completely like an untouched, off the shelf, thing. Their scenarios, they wanted two phones talking to each other. Okay. In this case, they were interested in the server, responses, but they needed to trigger the text messaging back and forth to each other. Right. So they're using the robot to update their Facebook chats. My first version, if you remember this old startup called Yo, it was a flash in the pan. They might be still around, but it was great. It was like a one-word text messaging thing where you could just send your friend a Yo. Yeah, okay. And so my first demo was like just two robots yoing with each other back and forth. I was pretty impressed with some. I upgraded the demo to playing, it was a duet of GarageBand, similar to what Jonathan Lips was doing. Yeah. But with the Tapster robot of playing Heart and Soul. Right. Yeah. Anyway. So when I first started it, I thought it was just a fun kind of hobby art project-y thing. And now I realized like real companies need this stuff. It's kind of like a tool of last resort though. Like if you could run it in a simulator, do that. If you could run it through the API, through the USB cable, sometimes there's no other option.
So that brings up a good point. I'm always wondering, I've been test automation for 17 years now. And doing UI automation, I had better luck with performance tests because it was headless and it was like HTTP communication. Where do you see the future? I mean, I just see at some point, UI automation is just not feasible. It's not like for large projects. There's got to be a better way.
Right. At some point, you basically design something that acts like a human in every way. So at that point, you basically have something like the Terminator, where it can test and it can do any interaction a human could, to the point where it's so good that you don't know it's a robot. So those are the two things. You basically have the Matrix or Terminator as far as where functional testing will go.
Right.
And then as far as what the humans do, I think at some point you're not exactly writing tests, like lines of code. Yep. You might be modifying like AI algorithms that spit out test suites. Yep. And so you're kind of like setting like the initial conditions to spit out like all the various scenarios that you want. Nice. Yeah. So you're kind of like stepping one step ahead. The other one is potentially like you're throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall, like you're doing a bunch of stuff. It's kind of random. And then, the tester is more almost like a data analyst, where you're looking at a lot of dashboards. Yeah. Kind of like if you'd be looking at like a Google Analytics dashboard, right, where you're just looking at, instead of like people traffic, you're looking at like maybe robots or AI, or just exploring your app. And now you're trying to find the aggregate data of where they're going, where they're not going. So it becomes very much like a data analyst kind of a thing. So maybe you're not actually clicking the buttons. The robots are doing that for you, but you're analyzing their behavior. Sometimes you're intending them to do stuff. Sometimes it's random. Nope. Anyway, so I could see it, like testing will never go away. Right. But maybe the days of someone like looking up the Selenium API and say like, how do I, get that window to go away? Like, how do I actually make that a double click and not a single click? maybe that'll be, you won't spend as much time doing that.
Right.
But yeah,
Right.
That's my,
Cool. All right. So how soon do you see that happening?
I don't know. So I read, so like, so we really are in this middle of this, like, existential crisis, robot,
Yeah.
whatever, what do you want to call it? I read all the articles,
Yep.
but there are, some people that are doubting, like, okay, fine, if the robots are going to take all their jobs, like, okay, where are they? I don't see them, right? Sometimes robots are like a metaphor for, like, the software, it's not the physical robots.
Right.
But either way, it's like, I think everyone's expecting it and super nervous that's going to happen today, tomorrow. But it'll probably happen, but way later. Like, it's going to be complicated. I remember in the late 90s, people were talking about, like, set top. The big next thing was like interactive TV.
Right. Yep.
And that was like the late 90s. And then it didn't happen.
Yep.
But then it totally happened. Now you can watch TV on your phone and you can click buttons. All the things that they promised in the late 90s for interactive TV totally happened now, 15 years later. But they all thought it was going to happen in the next, like, 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
So we're probably off by like 10 or 15 years.
Yep.
So it's going to happen, but we've got some time. I think we've got 15 years to figure out, like, to find our next job. Right. I don't think it's happening next year. Anyway.
Awesome.
But the one thing, though, one of my other hobbies is looking up how the job descriptions for various testing jobs.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was looking up at Tesla, and so manual testing. I mean, this is a big debate, right? Manual testing versus automated testing. Like, what do you do as a manual tester? There's a totally awesome manual testing job at Tesla, and it's basically like you get to drive around a track at 90 miles per hour all day long. Like, that's your job. Is you drive Tesla cars. That's manual testing.
Yep.
That's a manual testing. It's a manual testing job. Why aren't they coming to SeleniumConf? It's like, or whatever. But so I think the job is absolutely changing. But you're not going to be sitting at a keyboard, video, mouse, clicking buttons.
Right.
It's going to be, you're going to be doing, like, you might have to, like, hike up to Half Dome because you're testing, some GPS connections. Because I'm just imagining some weird scenario where you really have to get out in the world and test something. And if you have your Terminator, but the battery pack doesn't last to get all the way to the Half Dome. At some point, you're going to have to send an expedition to test all the equipment.
Right.
Like, that's going to, like, it'll always be there, but the jobs are going to severely change. It's not going to be, a cup of coffee in the corner, go to the office, write a bunch of tests, checking your spreadsheet. Like, I think those days are kind of over.
Right.
But
hey, thank you, Jason, once again for your automation awesomeness. The links of everything of value we covered in this episode, head on over to testguild.com/A540. And if you haven't already, make sure to click on the link to join the community for even more day-to-day 24/7 automation awesomeness. So that's it for this episode of the TestGuild Automation Podcast. I'm Joe. My mission is to help you succeed in creating end-to-end full-stack automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers. Hey, thank you for tuning in. It's incredible to connect with close to 400,000 followers across all our platforms and over 40,000 email subscribers who are at the forefront of automation, testing, and DevOps. If you haven't yet, join our vibrant community at testguild.com, where you become part of our elite circle driving innovation in software testing and automation. And if you're a tool provider or have a service looking to empower our guild with solutions that elevate skills and tackle real-world challenges, we're excited to collaborate. Visit testguild.info to explore how we can create transformative experiences together. Let's push the boundaries of what we can achieve.
The TestGuild Automation Testing Podcast. With lutes and lyres the bards began their song. A tune of knowledge, a melody of code. Through the air it spread like wildfire through the land. Guiding testers, showing the secrets to behold.